Hi, guys. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nuggets News. Today we've got a special guest, Harveen from Kommerce, and he's very familiar with Africa and blockchain, and you've built a number of logistics companies throughout East and Central Africa. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion about how blockchain and your project can help African development. So for people that aren't aware, what are the big bottlenecks due to the lack of infrastructure in Africa?
Hi, Alex. Thank you. Delighted to be here with you this morning on this call. The largest impediment to people participating in trade in East and Central Africa and really across emerging markets as well is the lack of financing available to traders. And this directly comes down to problems of trust in these markets. Lenders cannot trustably verify who has the propensity to repay them. And they often look to things like trade history to understand this. And in these markets, you often find that either this is not available, or where it is available, it depends on third-party verification that lenders have learned not to trust. And as a result, lenders just don't deploy financing.
Yeah.
And the upshot of this is that traders don't have the capacity to finance purchases in the volumes that they need to and that these markets demand. Right? So this is the largest problem that these markets face.
Yeah, I was reading some of the articles you've written for my research, and the stats are just amazing that some of these good businesses or even just the local corner store will buy enough groceries, but then they'll run out on the first day, and they can prove clearly that they'd be able to sell more and pay back the suppliers, but the capital just isn't there to do that.
Yes, in fact, there is a large amount of capital in the world looking for a return. And the challenge is to persuade those pools of capital that they can not just deploy, but also be repaid back with some fees.
Yes.
And the moment you can do that, I think you're going to see a large swing of capital into funding emerging markets trade.
So we hear about these, loan sharks in that research I was doing, that the loaning money at 10 to 20% a month, let alone a year, and predatory lending in the West. So that must be so hard for these people that want to borrow money to build their businesses.
It is, and it's heartbreaking to see sometimes the knots that people get into, because emerging markets do have issues with access to credit, right? So people will scrimp and save and borrow and put together a sum of capital, and they're doing a certain amount of business. For example, they're bringing in a container a month, and they have demand for 2 or 3 or 5, and they just can't access that. And to them, that means the difference between a marginal existence and one where they have security, financial security, where they have the ability to put their kids through a good education, where they have the ability to acquire better quality nutrition for their families, but they just can't. And what plugs the gap is the informal lending sector, and we see extortionate rates of interest being charged, 10-20% a month, sometimes more. And what do you do, right? We also have the situation that the formal lending sector either doesn't have the tools to engage with this part of the market, or is engaged in a systematic de-risking from this sector as a result of mechanisms such as Basel III and impending Basel IV compliance, which make it more difficult for the formal lending sector to outlay capital on non-core activities like trade.
Yeah. And as you say, other than the present means, the demographics are so favorable for these people, and a lot of the people in the West would want these growth rates and so on that are being offered in Africa, and all this money wants to find a home for investment, but it just currently doesn't have that banking infrastructure there. So we're hoping that blockchain can help them skip that step.
Yeah, I think it's just about understanding where the gaps are, and if we understand the gap to be one of a lack of trust, well, that's a key benefit that blockchain solutions bring to us, right? They give us the ability to maintain trustable ledgers of assets, and if you look at digital assets on a blockchain, and you understand that when they move, that movement can be trustably recorded, this gives us a key to a solution, right? And happy to chat more about that kind of solution.
Yeah, I was going to say, so Kommerce is solving a lot of these real world problems that we've just spoken about. What is it doing, and what are the flow-on effects once we start to solve these issues?
Okay, so I'll very quickly run through, what it does and explain why it solves the problem. And then I want to spend some time talking about the flow-on effects, because it's important to understand that when we solve these problems, a lot of good things can happen, right? So what Kommerce does is it mandates that traders use tokens to pay for trade goods. This is important because when they use these tokens to pay for trade goods, you can affirm that the payments have been made. Now, this allows us, the use of tokens in a trade solution allows us to take in deposits from traders, right, who don't have the capacity to fund larger purchases, but they can at least put in that deposit with the money that they do have. This creates an important game theory mechanism, like a hostage mechanism, to ensure that there's diligence in fulfilling the trade later, right? Use of tokens also allows the financier, in this case us, but we're hoping to widen it to other parties, allows the financier to then deploy co-financing to assist in the purchase of these goods. And use of the tokens in this system also allows the creation of escrow mechanisms to delay release of goods until certain conditions have been satisfied, right? So if we use tokens, we can do all this and then track the movement of tokens to extrapolate from there a trade history or a history of fulfillment of deals. And that's really what we're building out.
Yeah. And the flow-on effects from that for the families and for the communities and so on, once we have, the barriers, to, I guess, removed for this progress to start to really take off.
Let me give you some real numbers, right? So say a container of cooking oil of decent grade would cost a little under $20,000, 19 and some thousand US dollars, right? And this container would be typically ordered by a small merchant who has the capacity to do one container a month, right? And it would take 30 to 35 days to get to him from the time he orders it. And after he receives it, he sells out typically within a day. Now, I don't know if these merchants have the capacity or the demand to move one container a day for the whole month, so 30 containers a month. But they certainly have more demand than the one container a month that they're doing, right? And let's look at the numbers, right? On that one container, on that 20,000 and some outlay, this merchant would net approximately 10%. Okay, and in that or within that, he would pay his business costs, and then he would run his family and be left with a little bit of money, typically about $100 at the end of that month. If we could add a second container or a third or a fourth to the volume that he's doing on the security of the trade goods themselves, immediately we see that that merchant can have a jump in income. Now, this is not an abstract merchant. These are real people for whom the logistics business that I built up in East and Central Africa carries cargo on a monthly basis, right? And so we allow them the path to prosperity, where they can move from a marginal existence to one of earning enough to get by, to live well.
So just in that example there, we might have doubled, tripled, or quadrupled their income, and that very directly correlates to the quality of life and maybe being able to afford medicine and so on. It just snowballs the effects.
Yes, and speaking about quality of life, right? The consensus articulation for what it means to live in a better world, I think the best one that we have globally is the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, which were derived or rather agreed on in, I think, 2015. If you look at these, they cycle through lots of indicators like access to education, access to healthcare, access to clean drinking water, sanitation, and such like, right? Easily 2/3 out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals can be achieved if we just put more money in people's pockets, right? So people who are making decent money will want to procure good quality education for their children. They will want to make sure they eat well. They will refuse to live in polluted environments. They will put pressure on their elected representatives to be accountable to them, right? To create infrastructure that allows them not just to survive, but to thrive. right? So if we just focus on making sure that people have more money, the poor are great economists. They can solve a lot of these problems themselves.
And what would you say to people that have this stereotype of, people running around in Africa with, a pair of shorts on in the dirt and so on? It is developing. There are crude smartphones now. A lot of the population have access to, maybe a little renewable solar panel for some power for their home or for their school and so on. Is that changed a lot in the 10 years that you've been active there?
Yes, it has, and I want to just address this stereotype, right? Because this is a prevalent stereotype when it comes to talking not just about Africa but developing markets as a whole, right? But if you look at Africa, Africa is where the original digital wallet took root, right? Safaricom came up with M-Pesa, I think around about 10 years ago, and it just took off. And the reason it took off was that it solved a problem. It allowed people to transfer payment to each other for goods and services, right? And the need was so large that people were able and willing to transact on very basic feature phones using USSD codes. And that is a huge way that people in these markets pay each other. So, that stereotype, I think, needs some review, where the developed world has had good enough solutions in banking. The developing world has been able to leapfrog that and go direct to mobile, right? And so mobile device penetration is high and surging across most of Africa.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a perfect application of blockchain. We have that trust, we have that ledger for that record for the merchant, and we don't need millions of transactions per second to really open up these deliveries and keep that accurate record. So we don't even really need scaling per se for this application. So
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, if you look at Kommerce's scale up, right? We've planned a very gentle scale up that still encompasses large numbers. We're talking about, say, in month 24 from the time we start our first cargo shipments, we're talking about cargo in the 700 container range, right? Which might be encompassed by anything from 5 to 25 transactions in a month, right? So it's not enormous in terms of the demands it puts on the blockchain or available blockchain systems.
Fantastic.
But it solves a real problem.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Harveen, that's fantastic. I think we'll probably do a follow-up, but I really just wanted to get this initial interview out to spark people's interest, because we have had a lot of promising stuff come out of Africa. So any final messages for people today? And I'll put all the links in the description below.
Yeah, so two messages, right? The first is that when you look at the developing world, and when you look at Africa in particular, it seems like there are lots of intractable problems. But if we are open to applying blockchain solutions which solve problems of trust, I think we can attack some of these large problems, right? And the last message is that these solutions are worth creating, right? Because too much of the world is disadvantaged at the moment. And if we don't pay attention to that, this effect has the potential to spread, right? It is worth addressing these problems because we all invest in our safety, in our prosperity, if we make sure that we're all doing better together. Yeah.
Fantastic. I've really enjoyed that chat. Thanks so much for joining us, Harveen, and good luck with everything you guys are doing.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Cheers, guys.